Hello. It's good to see you all here. Thank you for coming out. From their origins in the aftermath of World War I, non-state actors have played a pretty significant role in the modern history of the Middle East. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the roots of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and suggest ways maybe to counter rather than to feed their growth and appeal. And we are privileged to have a return appearance by Dr. David Fenner. He's an affiliate faculty member at the University of Washington. And we'd also like to thank the University of Washington Middle East Center who sponsored this event. So, Mr. Fenner.
Thank you, Liz. I'm delighted to be back at Trinity Lutheran and want to do a couple of things by way of housekeeping. The first is a sound check. Too loud, too soft, too bass, too treble, too intelligible, or are you having to work at it? It's okay? In the back? A little bit higher. I can talk higher. Okay, good. Second sound check thing, related to sound. I'm getting older, and when I was a teenager, I went to entirely too many rock and roll concerts. And so these are all related to my hearing. So about 3 weeks ago, I had a respiratory infection. And that same weekend, I flew over to Spokane to do a talk. And the entire respiratory infection migrated during the airplane ride into my 2 ears. So when I landed and started to address the people at the Spokane School District, and they would raise their hand and ask a question, only their lips moved. Absolutely no sound. So I then had to guess what in the world it was they had just asked. On the evaluation forms, one of them wrote, his answers to our questions were ... sometimes responsive. So I am feeling much better, but if we can keep that same sort of good classroom behavior thing going, when you have a question or an answer or a thought or a comment, if you would raise your hand, then I will zero in on you, and as my 100-year-old mother now does, I will read your lips as well. But so thank you, first of all, for all being here, and thanks more so for being interested in the topic. Sometimes I think that our fellow and sister Americans are a little too satisfied with the shorthand version of things. And it's much easier to sort of put things into binary baskets. Well, this is good and that's bad. This is black, that's white. This is strong and that is weak. But the world really isn't binary in any possible way. So when I started to think about sharing with you all my understanding of the many roots of extremism in the Middle East, I sat down and made a list, and the list has 26 things on it. And I was telling my wife that I was coming up to Trinity Lutheran tonight, and I said, and I'm so excited to share these 26 things with them, and she said, David, 4 max. You can't do that to them. You won't make any sense if you do all 26. So I am going to be disciplined tonight, and I'm only going to come up with 4 major roots of extremism. And the other 22 minor little roots of extremism are going to come out anyway, and I'm going to put them over here. But don't tell my wife that I did that. And the reason why the numbers got so great was that I thought the best approach to understanding 2018 was to going back and understanding 2008, and then thinking, no, well, maybe 2003 was critical, and then thinking, no, it was really 9/11 in 2001, or was it the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990? What exactly was it, and how far back are we going to go to try to understand these roots? When Lev Tolstoy wrote War and Peace about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia and the Battle of Borodino in 1812, he started to write the novel and then thought, well, that doesn't make any sense unless I go back and look at the antecedent of that action. And then he kept going back and going back and going back in time. And War and Peace, the novel, starts in 1725, almost 100 years before the events of the Napoleonic invasion. We're going to do Lev Tolstoy one better. We're going to go back 1,500 years, but we're going to go back really quickly. I come from the Middle East Center at the UW, and we have a federal grant to take what we do on campus and in our scholarship and take it out to communities like yours to try to break down that barrier between the ivory tower and the rest of the community. So your being here tonight is helping us complete our mission, fulfill our mission, and it also, in theory, should get something from the University of Washington whether you go there or not. That used to be one of their slogans, and so I hope that that will be true as well. Now, last housekeeping aspect of the intro is this is not meant to be a one-way street. So I would love to come away from tonight full of ideas and questions and perspectives from you all about virtually any of the things that we talk about tonight. And I hope that that will happen and that you will feel emboldened to do that. Somebody once said that people hesitate to raise their hand in public fora to talk because public speaking is the #1 phobia in the United States. So I hope that you will steel yourselves, overcome any disinclination, and just raise your hand at any point tonight. We'll have a Q&A period, but anytime you can get my attention by raising your hand. One last thing. Somebody once said, I think it was J. Krishnamurti, said that education is as much about what you bring out in people as what you put into them. So, with that in mind, we're going to travel through these last 1,500 years, and much of what we see up on the screen, you will identify, I hope. Yeah? And you'll start to see by doing that that the roots of extremism in the Middle East do in fact go way, way back. This is the part of the world that we're going to be looking at, and I was lucky enough to live right here in the Sultanate of Oman for about 6 years. I was there as a Peace Corps volunteer in my young married life, and then 30 years later, my wife and I went back to Oman and spent another 3 years. That gave me the opportunity to look at Arabia from inside Arabia. Our Arabic got good enough to talk to people about matters of faith and diplomacy and oil. And so my perspective will come from someone who has spent some time in the Middle East. Next month, I'm going to Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar, all 4 of the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries. So I'm hoping that I can share with you some insights from Arabia, maybe from people you don't meet every day who have spent considerable time in that part of the world. Somebody once said, beware a speaker who puts blank pictures up on the screen, because then he knows that he's going to turn to you all and ask you for some help in identifying what's here. So, it's the year 632 of the Common Era. Why is this slide up here as we talk about the roots of extremism in the Middle East? Yes, sir. That's where Muhammad received the revelations from God that became the Quran that formed the basis of Islam. That's certainly true. Here's what it looks like today. The people over in Spokane last week were doing a section on what did we get from the fact that pilgrims all over the Middle East and all over the Muslim world would flow in and out of Mecca. And they started to make a list of all of the things that we received in the West from them. One of them that surprised me was we got the placeholder 0 from the Arabs who were coming through Mecca and then spreading it into Europe. We got algebra, we got algorithms, we even got our numerals, right? We call these Arabic numerals. Yeah? Okay, what's this person doing in this talk? We've just motored ahead about 400 years. Yes, sir. Yes, this is Pope Urban II. It's the year 1096, and Urban II has the distinction of being the first pope to mobilize a group of Christians to do what? Go to the Middle East, to the Holy Land, and recapture Jerusalem. This was more than 1,000 years ago, and in the common DNA memory in the Middle East, it was as if it were yesterday. Who are these two funny-looking characters? Good, the King and Queen of Spain. And what are they doing here? They expelled the Moors and the Jews and anyone who wasn't a Catholic. Yeah, yes, they did something significant in 1492. Yes, they funded an Italian explorer to go out into the world, and that began a whole 3 or 4 centuries of colonialism, of imperialism. Even though that was 500 years ago, in the DNA of the Middle East, that was yesterday. Next, Elizabeth I, good. About 100 years after Ferdinand and Isabella, the English had vanquished the Spanish in 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and Great Britain takes over as the main colonial imperial power on the planet. A couple hundred years later, a tribe of Bedouin in the very center of Arabia decides that they really would like to control more territory and, importantly, more water. This is in the middle of the 18th century. a man named Muhammad ibn Saud founds a dynasty, the House of Saud, the same royal family that is now in control of Saudi Arabia. And within a couple hundred years, he had expanded his territory to include Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam. This was the 18th century, so there weren't too many photographs, but artists' renditions of Muhammad ibn Saud, and he made an important bargain with a cleric, with a Muslim scholar named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And does anybody know what that important agreement was? This is 250 years ago. Muhammad ibn Saud and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab made a pact where the Saud family would take all of the political power and the Abdul Wahhab family would take care of all the theological issues. And they said, we'll support you in your political development if you support us no matter how we interpret the Quran. And that was a deal they entered into almost 300 years ago, and it's still in force today. Keep that agreement in the back of your mind. Yeah, Paul.
Is that agreement written down?
No. It's a good question. Not that I know about. It's probable that Abdul Wahhab was literate, but that Ibn Saud was not. Who knows what, but nothing has been found. But this pact soon became known to everybody in Arabia. Hang on to it for a while. Now, you might be surprised by who appears next. What are these guys doing in a talk about extremism in the Middle East? Who are these guys anyway? Ben Franklin, the founding fathers of the United States. What are they doing here? Say again? Yes. They came up with this crazy notion that maybe we shouldn't be colonies. Maybe we should have independence, self-determination, our own sovereignty. And it was just an absolutely revolutionary idea. And tuck this into the back of your mind, because this one is still in the DNA of the Middle East. The French Revolution, among many other things, égalité, fraternité, liberté, what was the absolute foundational component of this? That it wasn't the power that was vested in the monarch, the power was vested in the people. Res publica, republic is born. Keep that in the back of your mind as you think about the Middle East today. Anybody got a guess? No, a little bit before Teddy Roosevelt. This is Cecil Rhodes, the father of the Rhodes Scholarship, and he had this notion that all of Africa, for instance, and every colonial part of the empire should be controlled by Britain, by native English-speaking white people. And he also had a notion, if you look at the cartoon carefully enough, that he would be able to link Cape Town to Cairo with both the telegraph and with the railroad. And Cecil Rhodes is here also for another reason. Victoria, probably more than any other monarch in the British Empire, Victoria solidified all of the holdings of the British Empire. They'd lost the colonies, the 13 colonies, but had maintained almost everything else. Now, this is a special slide. Can you tell that some areas on the slide are in pink-ish and other parts are in white? Okay? What do you think the white areas represent? No. The white areas are places that England never invaded. Just let that sink in. You're starting to get a sense of where we're going with this. That the roots of ISIS go all the way back to the beginnings of time, essentially, but are accelerated, amplified by many of the major trends in world history ever since then. But when you think about this level of superpower intrusion, involvement, invasion, then you start to think about how could that be related to where ISIS is today? World War I. Why was World War I so significant relating to this topic? The Ottoman Empire is defeated. The Ottoman Empire was the home of the Caliphate, or the center of the Muslim faith, and an empire by its own right. Yeah? Why else was World War I, and particularly its aftermath, so critical? They divided up the world, and they did it in some really interesting ways. We've had the founding fathers up there. We've had Liberté at the barricades, showing the world that they were not beholden to the king. But now we've got Woodrow Wilson. He came up at the end of World War I with another crazy idea. 14 points that should be enshrined in our national consciousness, because those 14 points are a wonderful evocation of our founding principles. Chief among them, self-determination. So Woodrow Wilson came up with this idea right at the end of the First World War that all of the colonies that belonged to all of the empires should be given the right to determine their own form of government, manage their own resources, and have their own countries, not be vassal states of an empire. Now, what do you think the British and French thought of that? Yeah, they didn't think that was such a very good idea. T.E. Lawrence, known to most of us as Lawrence of Arabia, is sent into Arabia during that First World War to try to get the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire and help the British and the French to defeat the Turks, who were allied to the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. T.E. Lawrence goes to what is today still Mecca, finds Sharif Ali in Mecca and says, you have to turn on your fellow and sister Muslims for the good of humanity, and if you do, we will do all those things that Woodrow Wilson has promised. Self-determination, sovereignty, draw your own borders, you have your own countries. determine the form of your own government. I'd like this half of the room to just start thinking and talking amongst yourselves about what form of government you would like, where you'd like to draw your national boundaries, and just have a conversation about these big picture things amongst yourselves. Please, talk it up. Excuse me. Kim, would you mind holding that? Excuse me, would you mind holding that right over there? Oh, yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah, you want to be inside, don't you? Yeah. Good. Yeah, there you go. And draw it over there. Or maybe you could send it over that way. Now, what have you come up with? What have you come up with? Some really good ideas? Oh, by the way, I may have forgotten to tell you that you are now in Britain and you are now in France. And that everything we told you about self-determination, we weren't serious. You are going to be Lebanon, Syria, part of the Levant. You are going to be Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. And we British and we French are going to control everything you do for the next 40 or 50 years. We forgot to tell you that. The wonderful thing about this caution tape, I wonder if, sir, if you would read the name of the company that makes this caution tape. Empire. I was at Home Depot and I saw this and I had to buy it because it fit right into the topic. Now, folks, it gets worse. After a while, a colonial secretary looks into the British British area, controlled area, and he sees a group of Shiites in the south and a group of Sunni Muslims in the central part, and he sees some Kurds in the northern part. And so he takes out his pen and he lumps them all together right over the top of your head, if you wouldn't mind, Kurdish territory. And you hold that there, sir. And then he took a Iranian word, a Persian word, Iraq, and decided to call the Shiite and the Sunni and the Kurdish part Iraq. And in his, I think I better tell you who that is. Who was that colonial secretary? Winston Churchill. And in his letters, there is a phrase that says, as they were talking about forming countries within this large area, he says, "We'll call this Iraq. They'll be so busy squabbling amongst themselves that there'll be no trouble to the empire." That was 100 years ago that we got the legacy of not only the colonial interference with their self-determination dreams, but also specific interference with their national boundaries that have led to 100 years worth of problems. If the Sunnis in the center and the Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north could have determine their own boundaries, their own form of government, how would the last 100 years have been different? So that agreement was put together by a Frenchman and a Briton, and it's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and it's pretty famous as a kind of imperial division of the spoils of war, and as a betrayal of all of those Arabs that they had promised self-determination to. One sad irony of it is that when Sykes and Picot first proposed their agreement, right smack dab in the northern part here, I don't know if you can see it with this, but they had carved out an area for Kurdistan. And the British and the French and the Turks in particular said, no way are we going to have the Kurds have their own country. I don't know if you've been watching the news today and this last couple of weeks, but that border territory between Syria now, in the north where the Kurds are, and southern part of Turkey is a flashpoint in 2018. Yes. Yeah. Go back to our map. Why didn't... Yes. Why was the notion of Kurdistan, a homeland for the Kurds, so unappealing to the British and the French, and particularly the Turks? One of the challenges in the modern era is that Kurdistan is right here. Let's see if I can draw it without shaking my hand too much. Kurdistan is right here. What do you notice about that? It's in 4 countries. I think 4, and there's a good deal of natural resources under that territory that everybody else wanted, not only the British and the French, but also the powers in Baghdad or in Tehran or in Ankara. But it's also a kind of an area where the control of the water flow, particularly of the Euphrates, is vested in that part of the world. So it's a resource issue, and it's also I'm sorry to say, it's probably an ethnic issue. Kurds are not ethnic Arabs, though they are Sunni Muslims. And it could have been that age-old animosity among those groups. Today, there are almost 20% of Turkey is Kurds, and Erdogan, the president of Turkey, is I would say frightened by the potential that where they want to calve off a piece of Turkey and join it to a piece of Iran and Iraq and Syria and become a significant country. I think it's a resource issue and a political issue and a control issue, particularly as it relates to oil and water. Oil and water. Okay, we've talked a lot about ideas that came out of the American Revolution, out of the French Revolution, resistance to empire, the way the Americans did in 1776 when we declared our independence from Britain. And all of those are significant aspects of where we're going tonight, as is that agreement that Ibn Saud and Abdul Wahab made in the 18th century. Another significant agreement happened on board a ship in 1945, just off the Red Sea. Who are these players? That's Roosevelt on the right, and yes, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, a descendant of Muhammad ibn Saud, and they too made an agreement in 1945 on this ship. Does anybody know what that agreement was? Pretty darn similar to the one that Ibn Saud and Abdul Wahab made. Franklin Roosevelt said, "You provide us with oil forever, and we will provide your family with security forever." That's an agreement, like the one between Ibn Saud and Abdul Wahab, that is still in force today. The United States provides the Saudi government, the Saudi royal family, with virtually all of their security needs. And for the last 75 or 80 years, there's been a pretty uninterrupted, with some minor exceptions, flow of oil from Saudi Arabia to fuel, literally, the industrial strength, power, and development of industrialized countries. Yeah. This is another good question. Is it a written agreement? I think the answer is no. It's not a written agreement. For some reason, they didn't have a taping system going the way Nixon did in his White House. And there's stories of the interaction between Roosevelt and Ibn Saud are the stuff of legend. People can tell you a whole bunch of stories, some of which are probably true, but the vast majority of them are not. But the agreement apparently is not only a reality, but you can demonstrate how we have followed the tenets of that agreement for the last 80 years. Yeah.
What was the scale of the security of the Saudi family?
What was the detail?
The scale.
Oh, the scale. Unlimited. Unlimited. As far as anybody can tell, it had become so central, so critical, that we have an uninterrupted flow of oil into the West that Roosevelt, this is the only meeting he had. He's about 6 months away from his death. He came from Tehran where they were having a conference. He only met with one person not at the conference, and it was Ibn Saud. Apparently it was unlimited. Does that agreement still hold sway today? When President Trump returned from Saudi Arabia in May of last year, what was the big news item? Yeah. Say again? He was treated certainly royally, and what did he come home with?
We're going to sell all sorts of weapons to them.
$110 billion worth of weapons pledges to the Saudi government. Saudi Arabia has the fourth largest military budget in the world. Think about that. It's a tiny little country of 30-some million people. The whole region, as it develops around these new countries that were delineated by the imperial powers, as they gain finally independence, one of the things, it is a hallmark of the development in the Middle East that none of these Arab countries developed into a working democracy. Not one. And people like, do you recognize these guys? Yes, Hafez al-Assad on the right, the father, and Bashar al-Assad on the left, who took power in 2005. None of them became democracies. None of the governments lived up to the tenets of self-determination, one person, one vote, civil society. They all became what sociologists and political scientists call security states. What is it about security states that people don't like? Autocratic government, repression, what else? Control, We're losing our good hand-raising techniques. Yes, sir?
A slightly different question, but do you feel that the societies in those countries would be prepared to have a republic or democratic state?
My wife will say, you're cheating by using 2 boards. A brilliant political scientist has answered that question this way. Despair, unemployment, no civil society, corruption. What do those kinds of things breed anywhere in the world? Revolution. They breed a reaction against, they breed resistance. And as they start to breed resistance, what does the autocrat, what does the dictator then do? He tightens the screws. The dictator gets even more, what's the right word? Repressive and oppressive. What then happens down here? Groups start to form, resistance. And then what happens when resistance groups start to form? What does the dictator do? He crushes them. The dictator gets even worse. As a result, then, what happens to civil society, employment, desperation, corruption? It gets worse. You're starting to see the picture here. It's just the classic vicious cycle. Help. And this, in all of these countries around the Middle East, not one of the Arab countries escaped this terrible, what do you call it out in the ocean when it goes, a whirlpool of descending hopefulness. They went right down to the bottom of despair. They felt unempowered. They felt that they had no agency, and they felt like they had no society, and they were never asked, what kind of government do you want? What kind of society do you want? What kind of educational system do you want? There was no plebiscite ever. There was no vote ever anywhere. Never. This, if I had to turn the table and start to put numbers next to my 4, I would put the colonial period at the top, and then I would put autocratic governments right here, autocratic governments as the second main root of the ISIS tree. And then what I would put probably is hopelessness. All of the things we've mentioned are going to go over here in a little bit. That was the situation up until 1979, when a whole bunch of significant things happened in the Middle East. Among them were, the Shah of Iran was overthrown. What were the Shah's chief qualities? He was a great friend of the United States. He had a huge military. He sat on the peacock throne. In fact, he was restored to the peacock throne by the United States. Okay, the Shah of Iran is overthrown, and Ayatollah Khomeini ushers in the Islamic Republic of Iran. What else happened in 1979? Yes, sir.
So the extremists took over the mosque in Mecca.
Yes, they did. and it was a hugely significant event in the minds and in the polity of the Saudi royal family. It's as though you had already seen this slide presentation. A group of people who decided that the Saudi royal family were heretical, that they weren't living up to their Muslim obligations as the custodians of the two holy mosques in Mecca and Medina. And these radical Wahhabi, Abdul Wahhab, Wahhabi followers took violent control of the Mecca mosque. For 14 days, dozens and dozens of people were killed. Pilgrims were locked inside the Meccan mosque, unable to get out. This had a huge impact on the Saudi royal family. As you mentioned, the Shah of Iran was overthrown and replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini. What else happened that year? Happened to be the year I landed in the Middle East, but I had nothing to do with any of these activities. Yeah? Yes, sir. The U.S. embassy was taken by the Revolutionary Guards and a group of maybe, in quotes, students, and the captives were held for more than 400 days during the Carter administration, all part of the Iranian Revolution. One other geopolitical thing happened of great significance to tonight's topic. For some reason, and it's not clear from the historical records, Leonid Brezhnev decided that Afghanistan was a threat, that their allied political party who was in charge of Afghanistan was under threat, and they needed the Soviets to come in and help support them. And that became a 10-year invasion and occupation of Afghanistan by the Soviets. What then happened? How did the United States react to all of these activities, but particularly, how did we react to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? Yes. One of the things we're going to talk about tonight is this whole concept of jihad. Jihad appears in the Quran, and there's quite a long discussion of it, and there are two kinds of jihad. There is greater jihad and lesser jihad. Greater jihad, as Muhammad explained to the people in Mecca, had to do with your own development, spiritual, social, economic development, your endeavoring to be the best possible person you can be. It is a root of the word, comes from the verb to try or to endeavor. Lesser jihad, as Muhammad explained it, has to do with fighting defensive battles if you are attacked. So, in 1979, when the Soviets invaded a Muslim country, the United States and the Saudis and the Pakistanis got together and created this group that we called the Mujahideen. Mujahideen, the people who carry out jihad, literally in Arabic. And Ronald Reagan has this amazing quote about this group. I don't know if you can see it. He called the Mujahideen the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. He trained them, he weaponized them, the Saudis funded them, and the Pakistanis supported them, and they went by the tens of thousands into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. What's wrong with this picture? Huh? A lot of things are wrong with this picture, but they, in fact, were successful. in kicking the Soviets out by 1989. But then what did we discover to our horror? That these fanatical Wahhabi warriors weren't kicking out just the Russians from Afghanistan, but they wanted to kick out all the foreigners from Afghanistan, including us. And they eventually morph into the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and virtually every other fanatical, violent group that you can identify around the world. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, all have their beginnings in this group of mujahideen that we helped fund and create. Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Zarqawi, and most recently, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-styled caliph of the Islamic State, often called ISIS or ISIL. All of these guys have their roots in two things. They have their roots in that fanatical, intolerant sect of Wahhabism on the one end, and they've also been mobilized and activated by superpowers to fight proxy wars, and have been trained to do so. This is the chickens coming home to roost in many ways. Saddam Hussein was one of those autocrats who did exactly what we identified as being the vicious cycle. Saddam Hussein would brook no dissent, no gatherings, and remember, he was a Sunni in charge of a largely Shiite country, Shiite majority, with a substantial Kurdish minority. And yet, how did the Sunnis get control of that country? The British. Yeah, it was a divide and rule, divide and conquer philosophy of the British Empire, that we would privilege a minority in an area and then use that group to control the majority people. This was true of the Sunnis in Iraq. It was true of the Alawites in Syria. The French did exactly the same thing with this small group, sect of Islam, probably on the coast of Bashar al-Assad's family, the Alawites. The French privileged them, filled the army with them, and when the French finally pulled out, the coups that happened, 4 or 5 of them that eventually led to Hafiz al-Assad's taking control, those were the Alawites who were in control of a largely Sunni or Shiite country, a minority leading the majority. The Belgians did exactly the same thing with the Tutsis in Rwanda, and we know what horrors resulted from that. Saddam Hussein did the same thing. We're motoring ahead to the modern era now. If you had a talk on the roots of ISIS and didn't have these 3 guys in it, you're not telling the whole story, I think. What is significant about Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld in this context? Yeah, they did. They wanted to go in and remake Iraq in to their credit, in a better, more democratic tradition than it currently had, with a dictator running the whole show. And how did they do it? Did they do it through education and foreign aid and food for peace programs? No. we invaded in 2003, it's hard to, you can't overestimate the impact that had on two things. The modern era, where Sunnis and Shiites just hate each other, but looking at the beginning of the schism between those two groups, you can really look at 2003, because what we did when we went in was then we privileged the Shiites, and what did they do with the Sunni minority at that point? Slaughtered them, vengeance, revenge. They marginalized the Sunnis, and what did the invading power do with the Ba'ath Party? It disbanded the Ba'ath Party, which were almost all Sunnis. What did we do with the army? Disbanded it. They were almost all Sunnis. And then marginalized the people in the center of the country and implemented this. What eventually happens, of course, is that Al-Qaeda finds a very fertile ground in the central part of Iraq and starts to develop a linkage not only with other Sunnis who are now being discriminated against is too soft a word, are being nearly eliminated from the public life in Iraq by the Shiite government, but they also are the people who know how to shoot a gun. They know how to run a railroad. They had been in control of the government, all of these now marginalized Sunnis, and along come some Al-Qaeda recruiters and say, look, you're being pushed around by Shiites. You can't let that happen. Let's rise up, let's form resistance, and we'll start to resist the injustices from Baghdad. It's these guys that made what somebody once said was the Pandora's box of the 20th century, 21st century. Remember the story of Pandora in Greek mythology? Inside the box are all human emotions, are all human traits and characteristics. And she's warned, don't open that box, because all this bad karma will leap out and we'll be stuck having to deal with sloth and avarice and revenge and hate and greed. Leave them all in the box. But what does Pandora do? She opens the box. This is what the US and the British invasion of 2003 in Iraq did. It opened the box. Poignantly, in Greek mythology, Pandora recognizes her mistake and she runs over and closes the lid on the box, trapping one human trait inside. It's hope. Poignantly. So, we disbanded the army, we disbanded the government, we marginalized the Sunnis, and they started to mobilize against the occupying force and against the Shiites. And Al-Qaeda quickly morphs into ISIS. So if you needed to draw a timeline, you could draw a timeline from about 1928 all the way to the present. And you could plot groups of resistance fighters, some violent, some not, who used Islam, the religion, as an organizing principle for their resisting the dictators. The Muslim Brotherhood was the first one. Even though they renounced violence in 1950, they spawned many other groups of people. Hamas in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Al-Qaeda throughout throughout the Middle East, and most recently, ISIS and the Taliban. So there is an Islamic component to extremism, but it's not theological. It is, what can we do to create a large enough force that attracts enough followers that can help us get rid of Saddam Hussein, Hosni Mubarak, Muammar Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad. And they often turned to Islam because it was the only place they could organize. What does that remind you of? The Crusades, a little bit, but more recently, it reminds me of the civil rights movement, where blacks couldn't organize politically, they couldn't vote, they didn't have a voice, they didn't have equal protection under the law, so they turned to their churches as a venue for resistance. Some of them became violent, some of them didn't, but it's amazing the similarities with the development of the roots of ISIS. Remember when I told you that the events of the Crusades live in the memory of every Arab today, even though it was 1,000 years ago? The events of the Inquisition in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries live in the mind. The events of the invasion by the superpowers, England, France, live in the minds. And then along comes this set of photographs that we all shudder to look at from the prison that the U.S. controlled in Iraq, where we tortured Iraqi prisoners of war. No Arab will ever forget this picture. And if you needed to find a motivating phenomenon, it would be not only injustice, but also loss of dignity. After a while, in 2006 and 7 and 8, we gathered up all those Al-Qaeda in Iraq people and all of the Sunnis that knew how to shoot a gun and run a bank and run a railroad. And we said, you guys are now persona non grata. We're going to put you in a prison camp. And so we created a prison camp in the southern part of Iraq, where we put all of the Islamists and all of the retired or fired generals and colonels and majors and lieutenants from the Ba'ath Party and the army. And we put them all together in the same camp for 2.5 years. Now, if you wonder how I'm going to recruit more people to my cause, put them all together in a prison camp and watch the cross-pollination happen. One of the people, maybe not in this picture, but who was in Camp Buka, it was called, was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who would later declare himself the caliph, the head of the Islamic State. Along comes the Arab Spring, late 2010 in Tunisia, beginning of 2011 in Egypt and other countries, and people are fed up. All of these people living in all of these countries with no civil society are completely fed up. The quality of their life has gone down, the economies have gone down, and the people in charge keep getting richer and richer and richer and more powerful and more distant. And they finally rise up and say, no more, no mas. We're not going to put up with this anymore. And all throughout the Arab world, the people themselves rose up in resistance to the dictators that were in charge, which caused the dictators to do what again? Crush the life out of them. So, with the exception of Tunisia, where a kind of a democratic government is holding by its fingernails, holding on to control of Tunisia, every other Arab Spring uprising has been crushed. What does crushing a popular movement lead to? Yeah, resistance, misery, unhappiness, and then the dictator overreacts and the cycle continues. So this is pretty depressing, and I'm going to suggest some things toward the end that will give, I hope, a little bit of uplift about how we can get out and away from this vicious cycle. But this is really the story of at least the last 100 years and why we are saddled with fanatical, violent extremism. There is no better example of this. Yes, David. It's a good question. Is there a case where the Arab Spring was successful, but then as soon as the new people meet the new boss, same as the old boss, took power, then they too became corrupted, authoritarian? The only place where there was even an election happened in Egypt. And we probably remember that Mohammed Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood was elected president in Egypt in 2012. The first elected ruler of Egypt in 7,000 years. And he lasted just 1 year. He was completely ineffectual. He surrounded himself with other Muslim Brotherhood people, didn't reach out to the Coptic community, didn't reach out to other political groups. He didn't reach out, importantly, to the youth. And within 1 year, probably with the help of the Saudis and the Qataris, the generals with al-Sisi, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi at the top, had a coup d'etat and put Morsi in jail. The only elected ruler of that amazing country for all those millennia, and he's still in jail today. So the one chance they had to govern, they screwed it up. But did they screw it up because they were bad people or they were greedy or corrupt? Or did they screw it up because there was no tradition of governance, no tradition of being accountable to the people whom you govern? And that whole tradition has just been absolutely absent over the last 100 years in Arab lands in the Middle East. But it breeds fanaticism. There is no better example of any of this than Syria. If the situation of Syria is really complicated, and it's complicated because it's a civil war, it's a holy war, and it's a cold war, all rolled into one. And then all of these people who feel like they have a vested interest in what happens in Syria are involved. They're funding as many as 1,500 armed resistance groups in Syria that don't get along with each other and that get their funding and their support and their weapons from outside the country. But you've got way too many lines of interference coming into a small country with a dictator at the helm whose interest is in maintaining his power. Phew. On your reading list, the tan sheet that you have in front of you, are a whole bunch of really good books that focus on all of these issues, and the one I put at the top of the list is this one, Jihad Academy, available from your independent bookseller for not very much money. And it was written by a French journalist who was captured by ISIS, has absolutely no love for fanatical extremists, but he has, chapter by chapter, in a very readable way, looked at how we created a kind of an academy to teach people how to be jihadists. First with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, later at Camp Bucca, later in excluding the Sunnis from their leadership role in Iraq. This is an amazing book in a very short space. Another great read is Lawrence in Arabia. I think it's on your list, and it goes right back to the First World War and looks at how 4 different people, T.E. Lawrence among them, played critical roles in what became the Middle East as it was delineated by the French and the British. It's just an amazing read, written by another journalist. My friend and colleague Joel Migdal wrote this book not but 3 or 4 years ago when someone came to him and said, "Would you put all of your lectures you ever wrote together in a book?" And he said they wouldn't fit in a book. So they decided which ones fit, and he put them in there. But he too has a strong belief as a historian and with a political science bent that if you go back to the First World War, you can actually see the roots of many of the problems and the difficulties that we had in the Middle East for the last century. But they're all good reads. If you're interested in Afghanistan, there's nothing better than Steve Call's book called Ghost Wars. It's on your list, and a book by an Afghan writer, Tamim Ansari, called Games Without Rules, that's on your list. Another fabulous read if you're trying to unpack what Afghanistan is all about. Okay, before we round this up, what kinds of questions does all of that mountain of information bring to mind? Yes, sir.
Can you attempt to give your read of how ISIS fits?
Just asking if you could give us your read on how ISIS fits in the setting created by the Quran.
Yes, I can. One of the "26 roots of ISIS" that I wrote down was cherry-picking verses. And ISIS is a master. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who should know better because he's actually a learned scholar, but they take the one verse here and the one verse there and one verse here, and they say, now we've got Quranic foundation for what we're doing. And of course, they take the verses that underscore what they were planning to do politically anyway, and ignore the 99% of the other verses that don't support their approach to life. So I find the ISIS read of the Quran, oddly, a lot like the neocon read of the Quran, where they pick out the 3 violent verses and say, see, Islam is all bad. ISIS says we pick out these 3 verses and that gives us a foundation for what we're doing. So I think you can't read the whole Quran without coming to the conclusion that ISIS is an anathema to Islam. So many more times it says the word compassion appears. Almost at the beginning of all of the 114 chapters, it says, in the name of God, the compassionate and merciful. There is nothing compassionate about ISIS. It is a power grab, probably because they've been so badly repressed and somebody else has drawn their border lines. Yes, I understand that, but they have no foundation to my read as in the Islamic tradition. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Would you comment on the Israeli-Palestinian problem that has gone on for 50 years? One of the things I had always heard was that that was the key, that if we could settle and Palestinians and Israelis come to a peace agreement and each have their own state and rule, that would settle all the rest of the Middle East. Is that a myth, or would you comment?
I think that is a very insightful question, and it's going to cause me to violate my marital oath. Israel and Palestine. That is the foundational injustice that Palestinians feel, and by them feeling it, that the sort of the Bedouin telegraph in Islam means that every other Muslim feels it. And it so often says in the Quran, if an injustice is done to one person, it's done to all of us. There were 750,000 Palestinians living in what is now Israel in 1948, and they were almost all dispersed into other places. There are now about 4.5 million Palestinian refugees, mostly in the surrounding countries of Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. But if we could, and this is part of the uplifting thing I'm going to suggest, if we could do a kind of a Manhattan Project and throw our weight behind an equitable solution, allowing for Israel to exist and prosper and Palestine to exist and prosper, if we could take that whole issue more seriously, not declaring Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but trying to be an honest broker, then we would go a long way to dealing with one of the roots that we can actually do something about. It's hard to undo 1,000 years of colonial interference. It's hard to topple autocratic governments, and we often don't want to topple autocratic governments. We like the fact that he may be a son of a gun, but he's our son of a gun, is the old phrase about Central American dictators. We actually preferred the strong man control because it was an easier access point for security reasons and for resources. But this is the one that we really could make some real progress if we were in fact honest brokers. It's an absolutely great question, and it belongs on that list of 4.
Doesn't our millions and millions of dollars, US dollars, that go to just Israel exacerbate the problem because Israel came into that country as a minority.
Our aid to Israel is significant and largely military aid. It's matched, although, by our aid of the Egyptian government, almost dollar for dollar. So one of the other things that I think we'd have to put on the list is if you had a troubled region with no history of civil society and a great long history of colonial interference and a long history of injustice and desperation and lack of agency, what's the best thing to do in that region? Fill it full of guns. And unfortunately, we've done that with Israel, we've done it with Egypt, we've done it with Saudi Arabia. There would be no war in Yemen right now if we weren't providing all of the air support and intelligence to the Saudi government. That war would be over tomorrow if the British and the Americans decided it should stop. Why we're allowing it to go on, Yemen is one of the humanitarian crises that we should all really be concerned about, because those are American guns and bombs and planes that are being dropped on that benighted country there. So we're not the only ones that do this. The Chinese do it, the Russians do it, the British do it. The arms industry is a behemoth around this earth. Remember what Eisenhower said, beware the military-industrial complex. Apparently, that address he made to Congress went through 5 drafts, and in the first 4, it said, beware the military-industrial congressional complex. And he finally, his aides struck it out and said, you can't do this. You can't go out offending everyone in Congress. But they were all in the pockets of the weapons producers. Still are, one could argue. Yes, ma'am. We're going to round this up in a minute because I know you all want to go home and watch figure skating.
I understand that most states have factories producing arms. So therefore they're like Boeing. But I have a comment. You already alluded to the divide and conquer being on purpose. And then you mentioned the hothouse of the southern Iraq and the prison. They're not stupid. I think they're doing it on purpose. Okay, so a lot of this stuff, provoking, they want to continue to sell their arms. So if things go peaceful.
You know, there are people who believe that that is a perpetual war philosophy, that your company needs to sell more of these things, so the more conflict there is in the world, the better. But I heard an interesting statistic the other day that an F-15 fighter jet has component parts, each plane, made in every state in the United States. Yes, sir.
I appreciate your presentation and the points you've raised. I don't think it's a complete picture. It's impossible to give that. But one thing that I think is an important aspect of this is Pakistan and the relationship that Pakistan has with India. The Taliban were a Pakistani-grown student movement that was pushed into Afghanistan because Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and the other mujahideen were out of control. And Pakistan could not afford to have Afghanistan out of control by looking to their border with India in the one direction and Afghanistan in the other direction. They had to bring control over what they could in Afghanistan. And Saudi Arabia pumped a great deal of support into Afghanistan and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, but because his group was the most effective in killing Russians. They were crazy, they were brutal, but they were doing the job that was called for.
Those are all good points. One of the most telling aspects of South Asian history is when the British withdrew, where they drew the boundaries was so significant. One of the boundaries is between Pakistan and Afghanistan, but it's right down the middle of the Pushtun territory. So half of the Pashtuns in the world are in Afghanistan, and their cousins are in Pakistan. And that border has been porous sometimes and fortified at other times, but it's always been a problem. And it's almost as though they're thinking of still dividing and ruling by dividing small groups of people so that they're not a significant political force within each country. The border between India and Pakistan is even worse, drawn by Lord Radcliffe, and when the British were pulling out in 1947, he was commissioned to draw the border between India and Pakistan, and he got right up to Kashmir, and in his official document he said, and so on to the north. He didn't draw the border. So that's why Kashmir, to this day, is being fought over by the Pakistanis and the Indians and will become a flashpoint at some point. But there's a case where it would have been better to draw an artificial border. But again, on the Pakistani and Indian side, they went right through the Punjab, put half of the Punjabis in Pakistan and half of the Punjabis in India. It's an amazing history of cartography and what its impacts were on the rest of the world. But I think your points are awfully well taken, and if I could keep you for the whole week, we could cover all of those things. We'll do one more before we have a benediction. Yes?
Were you going to tell us what we're going to do about this?
Yes. That's a good one. What are we going to do about this? Yes. Before I do, let's recap. Sykes-Picot, where we divided up the Middle East between the French and the German powers, French and British powers. Our support Western interference of virtually every aspect of life, but in particular our support of the dictators, the Shah, Hosni Mubarak, King Abdullah, Bashar al-Assad. All four of these guys, and very many like them, received the same kind of outside support that allowed them to continue to rule with an iron fist over their countries. Remember when we talked about jihad, and I mentioned lesser jihad as being as sort of an authorization to fight when you've been attacked. And a lot of people say, well, who's attacking them? They're still fighting. And so I put this slide up here to show Americans, my fellow and sister Americans, something that you may not be aware of. But to an Arab, or to a Persian, or to a Pakistani, it looks like we've surrounded them militarily. And if you can believe the map, which is accurate apparently, then you could probably start to understand how a group of people might feel threatened or attacked. Not saying that that justifies anybody's violent reaction to it, but this is what's on the minds of people in the Middle East. They're seeing invading forces surrounding them, in particular their resources. This is a wonderful slide that I borrowed from somebody. Should probably think about giving them credit, but it is a breakdown of all of the historical developments in Islam after the Prophet Muhammad's death, the Sunnis following this route, the Shiites following that route. The next time I come, we can just do a Sunni Shia evening if you want. But the Wahhabi sect of the Hanbali school are the strictest of the strict, the most intolerant of all of Muslims, and it's that group that was in league with the Saudi royal family, and that became particularly potent when the Saudis discovered oil. When Roosevelt and Abdulaziz ibn Saud made that agreement on board ship, when the Soviets invaded and we needed a fanatical force to go and fight them, all of that springs out of this group of Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda supporters, ISIS supporters. Their worldview is very similar to that of the official religious ruling, almost, at least on religious grounds, group in Saudi Arabia, our main ally in that part of the world. And thank you for mentioning Israel and Palestine. Tear down the wall, Mr. President. Remember when Ronald Reagan said that to Gorbachev? And what did they do? They tore down the wall. We survived that period because the wall came down. As Pope Francis said, I'd rather that we built bridges than we built walls. This scar on Palestine is everyday assault on the dignity, I think, of people on both sides of the wall. This wall is not the way we are going to maintain our security in the future. And lastly, we've got to stop doing this. We have to figure out a way not to have such a involvement, interference, invasive attitude that allows people, not just in the US, but in Russia, in Iran, in Iraq, everybody thinks they have a vested interest in what happens in Syria. And it's just a recipe for disaster and tragedy and humanitarian sort of humanitarian death. It's almost like watching a country die. Now, what can we do? This is your turn. What can we do?
Just one quick question.
Yeah.
Sorry. The wall, was that around Gaza or is that in Jerusalem? I'm sorry.
That's actually, that one is just this side of Ramallah, which is north of Jerusalem, and it's dividing the West Bank from Israel.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what can we do? What of all the things we've mentioned that we already have done, sometimes the opposite is possible. What can we do? Say that again?
Lower our military, so
Demilitarizing would be one. What was that slide with those founding fathers doing there? What if we lived up to our principles? What if we supported the Democrats in a country and not the autocrats? What if we supported the peacemakers and not the warmongers? What if we supported the teachers and not the soldiers? There are things we can do. What else could we do?
Like that, to support existing groups, which are not very many, but that exist today, which do provoke conversation between Israelis and Palestinians.
Absolutely, and we can all be part of those groups, and I know that Trinity Lutheran is promotive of that kind of approach. What else can we do? You're doing it right now. Yes, sir. Yes, could we eliminate our dependence on oil so that we didn't, as Dick Cheney once said, our oil is under their desert. It's just hard to even say that with a straight face. Yeah, what else could we do? Educate ourselves, and that's one of the things. Educate ourselves and them, and read all of those books. Have this conversation with people in your community, at your business, in your school, at your church. Yeah, what else could we do?
Build bridges, build walls. You said it earlier.
Yeah.
And number two, not participate in supporting the brand of ISIS. You know, talking about it, associating it with Islam. It's you just helping fuel it.
This is a wonderful point. Yes, don't paint the religion of 1.7 billion people on the planet. Don't paint them with the brush of the fanatics and the murderous extremists, any more than you would paint Southern Baptists with the Ku Klux Klan, any more than you would condemn Catholicism for pedophile priests. Don't blame Islam. Unpack that more. Look at what's really going on, and then don't fall victim to that binary way of looking at things, good, bad, us, them. Unpack it and do exactly what else you're doing tonight. Yeah.
Actually, since about 1945, the CIA has been much more covert. So again, our figuring out is a book called Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer. You're familiar with it? And just remember that we need to address our Congress, okay? But there's also those hidden CIA actions and so on. So a lot of this is supported by our government because they're not flushing it out. So we have to keep pushing them.
I think accountability is all of our responsibilities. And if we can say, as our foundational, the bedrock of our citizenship here, we're so lucky. We've helped design our government. We've helped design our borders. We've helped design our representational form of government. But we have to hold them accountable to those first principles of liberty and justice for all. Yeah, one or two more ideas. You're coming up with all the answers.
The feeling that I've gotten this evening through this whole thing is maybe we need to address our fear. I think there's a lot of fear-driven actions that are going on, and I think by doing that as nations or as individuals, there might be more hope. But I think we tend to suppress that rather than face it.
Addressing our fears is absolutely a brilliant comment. And one way you address your fears best is address your ignorance about something, so that you learn as much as you can about it, and lo and behold, you don't feel the same way about it. It's amazing how many people have a negative impression of Islam. The next question they're asked is, well, what do you know about it? Nothing. And how those two things go together, right? If we can work on our ignorance, then we can work on our fears. Last one.
What is the role of the rest of Islam in this?
I think the role of the rest of Islam is best characterized by a couple of statistics. In 1915, the largest Jewish community in the world was in Baghdad. Just think about that for a minute. Islam, the center of the caliphate for 1,200 of those years, and the largest Jewish community was right there. The second largest Jewish community in the world in 1915 was in Aleppo, Syria. That's Islam reflected in some really meaningful statistics about how other people of the book, the Torah, the Gospels, and the Quran, have lived together for thousands of years and have lived in tremendous productivity in some places. That's Islam talking, but we somehow have forgotten that aspect of it, and we want to think about it as, again, us versus them. I think if we listen carefully enough, we listen to the voices of the other 1.75 billion Muslims, and we will hear that that's not the way we live. We live more like the tolerant, accepting community of Baghdad that had Assyrians and Jews and Kurds and Sunnis and Shiite all living in one place. But we have to get back to that sort of golden era, I think. Now, the other day I took my grandson to the Woodland Park Zoo, and as we walked into the flamingo area, for some reason, my grandson is 2.5. For some reason, all 20 of the flamingos were spooked by something, and they got up from one side of the pen and they ran across the top of the surface of the pond without going down into the water. They were just scratching the surface. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight when we've done exactly the same thing. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you. If you don't mind filling out your eval, it helps the federal government continue to spend its money wisely in an educational way. Thank you.